distinguished Dr. Gloria Afo-Mensah, Department of Economics, University of Ghana, whose background is in economics of maternal and child health. She's also interested in healthcare financing, policy evaluation, and the economics of development. I know she has supported GIMPA and has consulted for a wide range of organizations, including the Oxford Policy Management, International Health Network, and the Africa Center for Economic Transformation. I read somewhere, a little bit told me that she had been a visiting fellow with the American University program on gender analysis in economics. She assured me that it's just recently over. But I believe that she is well positioned and well prepared to give us the food we need to go forward. So I want to thank you for having me, and I look forward to working with you on this program. Thank you very much. At this point, I think it's my responsibility to invite Professor Akosua Darkwa to welcome us. She's the convener of NETRIGHT. Auntie Akosua, we are all yours. Yes. Thank you. Give the woman a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, Dr. Esther Ofeyabuaji, Auntie Esther. And a very warm welcome to each and every one of you here in the room and online for this event. I'm going to be very brief because, as Dr. Esther Ofeyabuaji said, we are here to listen to the speaker, so I don't want to belabor any point. But this is one of our flagship events. It provides food for thought for the year ahead, and I'm really glad that we are able to do it, albeit a number of months late. And I trust that when we get to the end of this year also, and we are inviting you to the next one, you show up in your numbers for this. So without much ado, I warmly welcome you, and with a round of applause, let's invite Dr. You know your name? I know Gloria, which doesn't help. Dr. Gloria Afo-Mensah, who is a new academic at the university. No, let me rephrase. She's a newer academic at the university. And it's nice to see that there are younger faculty members coming up. I did this year of review in 2010. So it's nice that 12 years later, another academic from the university can do this. And hopefully 12 years from now, the next generation will be here as well. So let's warmly welcome her.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairperson, and thank you, Professor Akosua Darkwa, for the introduction. I don't know, I really don't know what to say. I must confess that when I heard the call from Professor Abnodro about this program, I had a second thought. And I kept thinking about it, and it even worsened when I got to know the previous reviewers. I was really scared. So, yeah, so I saw big names that are my role models. So I was just asking myself, am I prepared to, step into these big shoes? But then I got inspired when I read the review by Professor Chikat. I think that was during the 20th anniversary, so it was 2019. So I saw a portion that challenged NETRIGHT to involve younger people. And so I just asked myself, maybe this is a call for me to get involved in some of these activities. So I'm really thankful to Professor Abnodro. I think she's not here, but wherever she is, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So what I'm going to do today is to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women's livelihood in Ghana. And so technology, I don't know. Okay. Okay, so is it possible to control it there for me? Oh, okay. All right. So in terms of the outline, I'll just briefly talk about some of the global developments with regard to the COVID-19. And then I would, of course, talk about the objective of today's presentation, which is to assess the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women's livelihood. So in this case, I'll also give you a brief overview of what is happening globally for the period 2021. But then because of availability of data, I will also talk about the period between 2020 and then 2021. And then our focus will be on the Ghanaian economy. Okay. Then I will just introduce us to some of the measures that were introduced to contain this pandemic and how they have impacted on women's economic rights. And then I'll have my concluding remarks. Okay, so after a year when this COVID emerged from China, if you look at the cumulative confirmed cases between 2020 and 2021, the WHO data says that the cases almost tripled in all the WHO regions. So we're talking about Europe, Americas, Southeast Asia, Eastern Mediterranean, and the Western Pacific, and then Africa. And interestingly, if you look at, of course, we heard so much about the US, and so we know the numbers. But what was striking when I saw this data was the case of Western Pacific. That between these two periods, 2020 and 2021, the number of confirmed cases grew by over 1,000%. Okay. Of course, in Africa, we did not record the high numbers, but then we also saw that between these two periods, the number of confirmed cases also tripled. We see a similar pattern when we talk about the mortality rates. And so the mortality rate in almost all these regions tripled. But then in the case of Western Pacific, it slowed down a bit. Now, when it comes to data of COVID-19 cases, a lot of countries are doing well. Unfortunately, we still have countries that do not have gender disaggregation of data. And so it's a bit difficult to, assess certain information in terms of women's perspective and then men's perspective. So out of about 206 countries that the WHO has data on, we have about 38% of them have either no information on gender disaggregation of COVID data, or the information there are just partial, so you don't have consistent information on key variables that affect women. So it's difficult to assess the impact by gender. But if you look at Ghana's case, so I just want to know if I'm the one controlling or you are. Okay, that's good. Okay. So if you look at Ghana's case, cases also tripled between 2020 and 2021. And what was even striking for me was that if you look at the number of deaths between these two periods, 2020 and 2021, cases almost quadrupled. In fact, when I saw this, I also got scared. Yes, our numbers are low, but then if you look at the rates, then it was also a bit scary. In terms of the gender breakdown, if you look at the morbidity, the infection rate is higher among males than females. That's about 15.2 percentage points higher. That's, I think you may have to ask the scientists, but I've seen a lot of, reasoning behind it. And, okay. But then if you look at the global level, I mean, it's almost the same. There's almost gender balance in terms of the infection and then the mortality. Just that in Ghana's case, we see that it's more common among men than women. Now, this COVID that started as health crisis, in the course of time became an issue when you talk about economic issues, and then social issues. So by economic issues, you're looking at employment, income, savings, and so on and so forth. And then there were also the issue of care crisis. That's what we call the social impact. So it wasn't just about health, but then other areas of life were also affected. And so in this chart, you see that as the COVID came and then governments were implementing the various measures like the lockdown, the closure of schools, and so on and so forth. People were working from home, even students were also schooling from home. And so there was a shift in the paid economy to the homes. So you have children schooling from home or workers working from home. And so there was an issue of child and elderly care deficits. Okay. And then once people are working from home, it means that the kind of household activities that typically it's undertaken in the house will also increase. So that's what we see here, a shift from the paid economy to the unpaid economy, which is typically about the household. Now, once we see a movement from the paid economy to the unpaid economy, then we talk about, like I said, care and then domestic responsibilities. And, well, in almost all economies, even in developed economies, you see that there is an uneven distribution of care work and then domestic work. Okay, so when I say domestic work, I'm talking about cooking, cleaning, washing, and so on and so forth. And once these activities increase, it becomes burden on the woman. And so you see that there was a disproportionate burden on women. So once we have an overview of what's happened, the purpose of my review here is to, like I said, look at the impacts of COVID restrictions on livelihoods, women's livelihoods. So basically, the focus is on during the restriction and even post-restrictions. We see how women's livelihoods were impacted. So when I say livelihood, we are looking at both paid and unpaid work. We are looking at income, savings. We are looking at their time. We are looking at issues with food security and health, so general well-being of the woman. And I believe that once we understand the impact of the pandemic on women, and in this case, what I did was to look at it in terms of losers and gainers. So I use these two terms carefully because it is a fact that in any situation, some people gain, others lose. So if you are talking about livelihood, you have to look at those who gained and then those who were at a loss. And this is very important when it comes to policy recommendation, because once we're able to understand the impacts, we're able to make informed policies that will make the woman better off economically, psychologically, emotionally, and all the qualities of well-being that you can think of. In terms of data, well, it's difficult. As at now, yes, we know that the Ghana Statistical Service has a survey on COVID, but the actual data are not available. So what I did for now was to rely on the various reports that they have issued. And I must say that with the help of Professor Abnodu, I'm trying to get the actual data so that we can know the impacts really on women. But of course, from the reports, I'm able to do some sort of deductive reasoning so that we can infer from the general impacts and then transfer it to how the household and then the woman will be affected. I also look at the International Labour Organization database for some of the gender gap statistics. And then, of course, I relied on useful studies, especially the one by Odro and Chikata in 2020 for NETRIGHT. So what they did was to look at the various COVID measures from a gender lens. And that report was very, very useful for this study. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, looking at the impact, I first look at it in terms of the global perspective. Okay, now globally, almost all the countries, both developed and developing countries, we see that women were overrepresented in sectors that were most affected. So we are talking about closure of borders, ban on international travels, and so the obvious industry that comes to mind is the tourism industry. And the tourism industry relies heavily on the hospitality industry. So these were obviously affected. And you have a great representation of women in these industries. And then the health sector. So in a lot of countries, women are overrepresented in the health sector. So the first point is just obvious. The fact that women were overrepresented in these sectors mean that all things being equal, they will be the ones most affected by the restrictions. Then you look at the informal sector. The informal sector also suffered greatly. And there's a report by the ILO for 2020 that says that for workers in the informal sector, they were 3 times more likely to lose their job relative to their counterparts in the formal sector. Okay. Unfortunately, if you think about the informal sector, they don't have the social protection programs that the formal sector have. And so once they are being exposed, it even makes them more vulnerable. Okay. Then, again, if you look at it in terms of the nature of the economies, yes, every economy, whether developed or underdeveloped or developing, has some sort of informal economy, what they call gray economy. But in the developing countries, just like Ghana, you see that the informal sector is the dominant. Okay, so once they are suffering disproportionately, then it means that then women also face trade-off between unpaid care work, and that there was a movement from the paid economy to the unpaid economy. Now, typically, women, in most economies, it's assumed that caregiving is a responsibility of the woman. So once you are giving care, all things being equal, we have just 24 hours in the day. So you are always faced with, if you want to do the work yourself, then you have limited time to engage in paid work. And so once the COVID led us to a shift from paid to unpaid work, then it means that women, if you have to do a lot of these household activities, then you have less time to engage in paid work, even if it's available. Okay. Well, the formal sector was also not spared. So we have businesses that were automated, and there was also decline in the time together at home. So the chances that there will be violence will be high. And even for the fact that a lot of people lost their work, a lot of people were impatient. And I also saw a study by UN Women where they reported increase in abuse within the period 2020-2021. Okay, and there are some men who are victims, but then in most cases, women are the victims. Then another impact globally, if you look at some works that have been done, was that there was increased competition for available job offers from men who lost their job. So this time, a man who loses his job also comes in to compete with the woman who is looking for a job. So once there is increase in competition, and you have in most developing economies, for the employer, if he sees a man and a woman, they think that because the man is the primary earner, they are more likely to give the job to the man. okay, because he thinks that, well, the man needs to get a job so that he can provide for the home. Okay, so there was that unfair competition for job offers for men who also lost their job. And then finally, we also recorded increase of early marriage. And a Save the Children Foundation reports that between 2020 and 2025, this will increase by 2.5 million. I mean, 2.5 million girls will be at risk. And interestingly, they project that countries in South Asia and Central Africa and West Africa will be the ones that will be hit hard when it comes to early marriage. So clearly, women or girls will be at risk. So those are some of the impacts that globally you see that women faced. Now let's come to the Ghanaian context. So in the main review, I tried to provide a summary of the COVID situation. And once we are all in Ghana, so we are aware of some of these things. So I'll just skip the summary part and then look at Ghana in terms of, even forget about the COVID. So let's look at pre-COVID period. Gender, even though Ghana has done well in terms of gender parity, there are still gender imbalances in a lot of areas. So if you look at labor force participation, the female rate is lower than the national average, and it's about 9 percentage points lower than the male rate. Okay. If you look at the unemployment rate, it's also higher amongst females than the national average and then the male average. Okay. Then, if you talk about people who are in vulnerable employment, more women are in vulnerable employment than men. So we're talking about employment with low earnings and no social protection programs and so on and so forth. Then there's also the issue of gender asset gap. So women own less assets, and unfortunately, the kind of assets that women own, typically own, are of lower value than what the men also own. So once you have an idea about the pre-pandemic period, of course, you can also say that it's not that bad everywhere. We've seen remarkable improvements in areas like primary and secondary school enrollment, where we have almost, the gender parity index is almost 1. Okay. So clearly, if you have a country that is characterized by such gender imbalances, then the expectation is that if you are introducing any policy, the policy shouldn't be gender blind. If you really want to close the gender gap, then whatever policies that we introduce should be gender sensitive. Okay. So again, I'll refer you to what was done earlier by Odro and Chikata for NETRIGHT 2020. And they made a very good presentation about the various COVID-19 measures from a gender lens. Okay, and the conclusion is that most of the measures that were introduced were not particularly gender sensitive. Even the ones introduced to the households in terms of electricity subsidies and water and so on and so forth, they were mostly general. Okay. Next slide, please. Good. So in discussing about the impacts, again, recall that I said something that started as a health crisis generated economic crisis, and then the care or social crisis. So what I did was to look at the impact in terms of the economic impact and then social impact. So by economic impact, we're looking at employment, income, savings. Okay. So the first one here is employment. And for us to understand the impacts of COVID on women's employment, it's important that we get to know the gender dimension of employment in Ghana. So this is a table I took from the work by Odro and Chikata. And you see these are the major industries that we have in Ghana. And the text in red are the female-dominated industries. So we see manufacturing, wholesale and retail, accommodation, and food services activities. And you see the women representation. So these are in percentages. So if you take, for instance, manufacturing, 16.1% of them, we have 16.1% of women engaged there compared to 7.4% of men engaged there. In fact, what is even striking is this, the accommodation and food services industry, where you see that women are about 7 times more than male participation in that industry. Okay. And there are other areas that, of course, men dominate, but then you still have significant representation of women. So education, okay, even though men dominate, the difference isn't that big. You see agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Also, the men dominate, but the difference isn't that big. So once we know the gender dimension of employment, then once we begin to talk about the measures, we know which industries were more affected and so will affect women more than men. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we pick just the closure of borders and then the ban on international travel, this certainly affected tourism. And we see, at least we know from the table that tourism depends heavily on accommodation and food services. And this is an industry that is dominated by women. I told you the women representation is about 7 times more than men. So if you have closure of, some of these firms in these industries, then it means that women will be disproportionately affected in terms of employment loss yeah. And then this is also another industry, the accommodation and food services industry also depends on activities from wholesale and retail. So these are along the supply chain. So if you have more hotels, guest houses and other firms in this industry closing down, then it means they will not demand these activities. And remember, the wholesale and retail activities in the table I showed earlier are dominated by women. So women were more likely to lose their jobs than men, for the fact that the industries that were most affected are female-dominated industry. Even if you talk about education, the school closures, you see that even though male dominates in the education sector or industry, you still have a good number of women engaged in the education activities, so they were also affected. So when you talk about employment, clearly you see women were more affected. Next slide, please. So I told you earlier that the Ghana Statistical Service has a survey that is not out yet, but then the reports are out. So I checked the reports for business closure by industry. And you notice that 2 of the sectors, so I just take the other services out because, it's a composition of all the other sectors that are not here. But if you count the top 5 industries or sectors that were affected by business closures, then accommodation and manufacturing are part. And it's just to support the fact or the intuition I made earlier that for the fact that female-dominated industries are being affected, then they are more likely to lose their jobs, or even in some cases, if they don't lose it outrightly, then their number of work hours will also decrease. And that should translate into their income. Next slide, please. So this is just directly from the effect of employment. So once you are losing your job, all things being equal, your income will either decline or you lose it. Okay. So again, from the report by the Ghana Statistical Service on the COVID-19 tracker of households and jobs, we see that 70% of households experienced income losses or decline in income. Okay. And then in terms of business, so if you look at It's as a woman being an employer or an employee. So in this case, because we're talking about sales, so assuming the woman is an employer, again, you notice that the female-dominated sectors were among the sectors or the industries that were hit hard by the pandemic. And so the effects on women, the potential effects on women's income will be more. Next slide, please. So here, what I just did is just to, summarize what I've said with regard to the income. So once you have the COVID-19 measure, whether you're looking at lockdown or the social distance protocol, of course, it will affect the operations of businesses. And then you see the income loss. So I came across a study that was done by Rego, and they confirmed this assertion. So the study was certainly about informal, women in the informal sector. And they did this study among some market women in Accra, and they confirmed the assertion that as of July 2020, the incomes they earned were just about a third of the pre-pandemic level of income. Okay. And then I also saw this. Please go back, please. Okay. So I also saw this from one of the websites where a woman was sharing her experience. Remember the social distance protocol. So this is a market woman at the Labadi market, and she said that they divided the market sellers into two teams, which we are very familiar with. So, one team was red, the other was green. One team could come in the morning, the other during the afternoon. It affected all of us because it meant less hours working every day and less money. So that's a clear, deduction from what I've just said. Next, please. Then the third impact is on savings. So once employment is affected, and then your income is affected, all things being equal, you will not be able to save more. So you rely on your savings, or your savings will decline. Okay. And again, this was also confirmed in the report by the Ghana Statistical Service on households, the COVID tracker on households and job. And we found that for almost half of the households interviewed, they said savings, or the savings was a coping strategy. So most of them were rather depleting their savings. Okay. And once we are building a case, so if women are more likely to lose their job, and so their incomes are more likely to fall, then obviously they are also more likely to deplete their savings. You get it? Okay. Next, please. So those are the economic impacts. Then we talk about the social impact. So the first case is the unpaid care work. In Ghana, our policies are such that the family is the primary caregiver. But we know that in every family, the woman is supposed to be the caregiver. Okay, now that we know that the pandemic led to a shift from the paid economy to the unpaid economy, then it means that women are more likely to have an increase in their caregiving responsibilities. So in this table is a table I took from a study by Kin and her colleagues, and they used the 2009 Ghana Time Use Survey. So it's just for us to know the distribution of care work within the household. So it gives us the average time spent on unpaid care work. So unpaid care work, we are looking at direct child care, so giving care to a child, and then elderly care. Then we have the indirect care, like the domestic responsibility, so cleaning, washing, cooking, and so on and so forth. And if you look at that survey, the time use survey, which was also carried out by the Ghana Statistical Service, women spend on average 54 minutes in doing these activities, whether the direct care, any of the direct care or indirect care. But that's for a day. but men spend just about 9 minutes. So clearly, about 85% of care work is done by women. And so if you have a pandemic period or post-pandemic period where we are doing a lot of things from home, then obviously women will be the ones that will be burdened most, because we get to know that in a typical Ghanaian household, nearly 85% of care work is done by the woman. So if there's an increase in unpaid care work, then the women will be the ones that will be affected most. And once you are spending more time doing these things, then it means you have less time for paid work. And so your labor supply, women's labor supply, will fall. Okay. Then the issue of food insecurity. So when we say food insecurity, we're looking at going without food for a day. And all the 3 waves of the Statistical Service COVID-19 household and job tracker report some households being food insecure. Interestingly, like I said, there are 3 waves. So the first wave was done in June 2020, second in September 2020, then the third in December 2021. So if you look at between the first 2 waves, yes, we see that the proportion or the percentage of households that were food insecure fell. But then in the last wave, or the most recent wave that was done in December 2021, we noticed that nearly 1 in every 10 households survey was food insecure. So it means that members of that household went without food for at least a day. Okay. Then, for the fact that a lot of households reported reduction in food consumption as a coping strategy, also means that then there's a threat to food security, because if you have to cut down the amount of food you consume, then you are not getting the required amount of food you need for a healthy life. Okay. And here the deduction is that women and children will be the most affected, because we know in Ghanaian households, in a typical Ghanaian household, the best portions of the food given to the household head, who is typically a man, or the male members of that household. So they will give the best part of the chicken or, everything to the man. And so if you are talking about food insecurity, then women and children will be the ones who will be hit hard. And again, I found a study by Rego that confirmed this. So the study was on women informal traders in Accra and Durban. And they confirmed the fact that a lot of women were food insecure within the period. And again, if you look at the same report by the Ghana Statistical Service, you see that 18% of children in households surveyed ate fewer meals than usual. So once we talk about food insecurity, women were the most affected. Next slide, please. The next social impact is on health. And for the fact that health workers in Ghana, we have a lot of women in that sector, means that they were more at risk. Okay. And for the fact that because of COVID, working hours were increased, it means that they will suffer most. I mean, they will be stressed a lot. Yes, somebody will say they were compensated, but then there's always an opportunity cost. Working for more hours means that you lose some time that probably you can do for household chores or other things. Or for the fact that you're working hard means you're stressing your body. So, I mean, the body is not a machine. And clearly, I mean, the compensation might not even be enough to take care of that stress. Okay. And also, during this period, we could also see that a lot of government attention to the health sector was in terms of, providing COVID-related materials. And so other issues of health were also affected. And interestingly, I was one of them. So people afraid to go to the hospital even for primary health care, because they thought that the hospitals were not safe and you may get the COVID infection. So people were not going for their usual routines. And the study by Odro and Chikata confirmed this, where they noticed a decline in antenatal care services. And like I said, so I'm waiting for the data from Ghana Statistical Service so that we also confirm from that survey that they conducted. Then once we're talking about health, the issue of domestic violence. So we've already seen that if all things being equal, if the man and woman are spending more time at home, then there's the likelihood that, tension will arise, and then the women are mostly the victims. And a study by UN also confirmed that there were a lot of incidents of domestic violence, within the period. Then the next issue is about time poverty. So this is something that is not normally talked about, but it's very, very important because time is limited. It's a limited resource. We have just 24 hours in a day. Okay. But for women, for the fact that you are burdened with paid work and then unpaid work, it means that our time is even more limited. Okay. But this time poverty is very important to, development, because if, for instance, the woman is not overburdened, you have some sort of equal or near equal distribution of unpaid care work, then the woman also gets time to contribute to the economy's, productivity. And we're talking about our GDP. So, you get some contribution from women too. So it's a developmental issue. And also for the fact that if you look at time poverty from a gender lens, you are also promoting social justice. Okay. So, for the fact that you are burdened with unpaid care work, then it's sort of social injustice. And that is what we saw from the pandemic, the fact that women are overburdened. And so it is important that we look at some of these issues with gender lens. Okay. Next slide, please. So you can realize, or at least from what I've said so far, it's as if it's all about losses. So we look at who were the gainers. Okay. So clearly some business opportunities were opened. So we see from the pharmaceutical industry that during the period 2020, even 2021, a lot of us were more concerned about our health, boosting our immune system, and so we're demanding certain drugs more and gave them opportunity to increase their production, or even new medicines came out. Unfortunately, this is a male-dominated area, and so women don't get to benefit more. We saw an increase in food import substitution. Okay, the fact that borders are closed to human traffic means that certain food imports too will be affected. Okay, and we saw an increase, buying from a lot of people, and so again here this is like gaining, and we have more women being in this sector, so they gained. Okay, then we have the textile and garment industry. Yes, so at a point where we had shortages in nose masks and other PPEs, we sought to, local production, so the cloth face masks and other things also came in. Yes, some women gained, but this was only short-lived because we saw that with time, the supply increased, and so the prices fell, and the gains were just over for them. Apart from these broad industries, there are also some individual gains that, so there's a show on CTFM that they do, this business show, and through you get to know about women who lost their jobs from the formal sector, took advantage of the supply shortages that we had, and then they are engaged in some food production activities. Okay, so that some people also gain from that regard. And I remember this, just beginning of this year, I listened to a show like this where the woman was just recounting how she suffered. But then she came out with this idea where she does mashed cake and granite cake and so other things. And the business is doing well now. Okay, so it's clearly some people gain, but it's just that the gains were, of course, the pharmaceutical industry that gained a lot was an industry that was male-dominated, so not a lot of women gained in that regard. Next slide, please. Good. So here, what I do is to look at how the COVID policies influence women's economic rights. So from a 1992 constitution, when we say economic rights, it's defined to cover, right to work, equal pay for equal work, right to rest and leisure, right to reasonable working hours and periods of paid holidays, and right to form or join unions. Okay. Now, if you look at this definition, it's clearly it's limited in a way that in some places, some areas, the economic rights is extended to cover right to housing and even right to food security. Okay, so these are some of the issues that, we have even in our constitution. And for the fact that if you look at this definition, it relates to the paid economy, it means that it ignores the unpaid care sector where women dominate. Okay. And again, during the period, we saw or we heard calls from the WHO and other organizations for gender-responsive action in government responses to the pandemic. So the obvious question is to what extent do or did we see this in Ghana? And again, I'll refer you back to what Odro and Chikata did. From government's immediate response, where we had the coronavirus alleviation program, we saw the support for businesses, the CAP business, for micro, small, and medium enterprises. In fact, this is a sector that is dominated by female, enterprises. So had a very good, potential for reaching more women. But the unfortunate thing is that if you look at the application process, such as, the online application where we already have gender gap in access to internet, and then the requirements of the tax identification number and annual sales. How many of these micro and small, medium enterprises keep such, information, annual sales? Talking about women doing her own, small business. It was very tough for a lot of women to reach out to this support. Currently, we are under what they call Ghana Care. So it was introduced in 2021 and it's supposed to end in 2023. And interestingly, if you look at the program, I saw that it specifically targets 2 female-dominated areas, which is good. So the manufacturing industry, textiles, and garments. So, these have good potential to reach women. So if you look at the manufacturing sector, it says the objective is to build Ghana's light manufacturing targeting agro-processing and food import substitution through support to local businesses. And the policy outlines that are going to use the planting for food and jobs and rearing for food and job. But if you look at the policy itself, it doesn't really show how it's going to, target the farmers involved. But you have in Ghana here, over 70% of the food we consume are consumed by women farmers. Men are typically engaged in cash cropping. So if you have such a policy that's, targets male-dominated industry, then the strategies that you want to adopt should be gender sensitive. So it's not just about giving support to farmers, but also trying to target female or women farmers so that, again, you not only increase your local production, but you also bridge the gender gap in the sector. The same with the textile and garment industry. So if you look at the program or the policy, says it wants to generate about $200 million export revenue and create 50,000 jobs in the industry. But then it's silent on how the jobs are going to be created. So the point I'm making here is that these strategies need to be adopted from a gender lens so that, yes, you increase or you achieve your objectives, and then you also bridge the gender gaps in the sector. Next, please. So, yes, so that's basically what I've been doing with regard to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women's livelihood. Okay. Now here, in the midst of, these challenges, of course, we have a lot of women to celebrate. We cannot bring all of them here, but these are just a few of our girls and women who excelled in the period. So we have the Methodist Girls Senior High School in Manfie Kriapem, who won the World Robotic Competition actually twice in a row. And then we also got our first female general in the Ghana Armed Forces. Unfortunately, I think she passed on a few weeks ago. But it's something that, yes, we need to celebrate for the fact that we've had our first female in that rank. And yes, the list is just endless. We also, because I'm from University of Ghana, it's important that I become biased. So we also had the first female vice chancellor being appointed. And then even the chairperson for the governing council is a woman. And yes, this you see are just for the formal sector, but clearly there are a lot of women in the informal sector who are also excelling, okay, or who excelled during the period that, it's worth celebrating. So to end my presentation, I just have a few points here. Well, nobody has been spared from the pandemic, but clearly we've seen that women have been either in the sectors that were most affected, or for the fact that we have this, they are more in the informal sector, made them very vulnerable. And so as a country, what do we need to do? So it's important that we take the implementation of our social security program for the informal sector seriously. Most of them are not engaged. They don't have social net programs that they can fall on if they face any negative shock. And so this is something that we have to take very seriously. And something that is also dear to my heart is the fact that the pandemic highlighted the importance of unpaid work and the role of women in the economy. But if you go through the various measures that were introduced, well, I'm yet to see. So none of them clearly talks about the issues of caregiving. And it's important that we begin to think about it because, well, women are the caregivers. And you know the trade-off. Once you are doing that, it also affects your labor supply. And also for the fact that we as a nation, the life expectancy at birth is improving. So meaning that if before, all things being equal, somebody can live up to, let's say, 60 years, 65 years. Now that all things being equal, the person can live maybe 70 or more years. And so it increases the elderly care, okay, and that falls on women. So it's important that we we invest in the market for care, because not only are women likely to benefit in terms of being the supplier. So if you have a market for care, women are more likely to be the employees, okay? But also for the fact that if you have a market, then they have an option. So those who can afford will afford that, and then they can be engaged in paid work. So that's very important. But if you leave the care, investment in care to be done by the private sector, obviously some people will be affected, the low-income households. So that is why there's also the need for public provision of care services. It's done in, the developed world, and we have to start thinking about it. how to invest in the care economy so that we give women option and we also provide work for women. Okay. And then this is also an interesting point that I note here, that we talk about maternity leave, but I think that we should begin discussions about paid paternity leave. It's done elsewhere. So that, I mean, unpaid care work can also be done by women. So I've forgotten the country, but I had an experience when a friend of mine was saying that, so men can take paternity leave, I think, for 5 days, but you won't take it and go anywhere. You have to take it and show proof that you are working, I mean, you are bonding with your family, or you are taking part of the unpaid care work at home. So this is something that I think is a food for thought, and we have to start, talking about this issue so that we make women better off economically, emotionally, and then psychologically. All right. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Another warm round of applause. Dr. Afomensa has given us a lot of food for thought, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications for women's livelihood in Ghana. She has given us quite a bit of international background, the tripling of confirmed cases, the issues, the triple crisis of the pandemic, ranging from the health with implications for the economic and social aspects of our lives, the uneven distribution of the pandemic's impact, the shifts from the paid economy to the unpaid and home economies, and this disproportionate increase in the burden for women. She gave us quite a bit of data referring to the GSS survey on COVID-19 households, the business tracker, the overrepresentation of women in the sectors most affected, like tourism, hospitality, retail, amongst others. She reflected on the informal sector and also the trade-offs between unpaid care work and paid work. Even she alluded to something which was interesting to me, the move towards automation and the decline in consumer demands, the issues around mental health, and worryingly for me, the incidence of early marriage, amongst others. She reviewed the information and indicated to us that quite a bit, we expected that COVID-19 measures would be more gender sensitive than they were, but they were largely gender blind. And this had implications for the effects that it had on women alongside men, citing the issue of market traders. And indeed, if you look at other informal economy players like KIA, like waste pickers, and so on, there is very interesting information over there. She looked at the issues around food insecurity, the categories of workers at risk, the very critical issue of time poverty, to which we should pay a lot of attention as a developmental issue, and then looked at some of the measures that had been put in place. She considered the gainers and the losers in the process, the fact that pharmaceuticals are male-dominated. I would be interested also in looking at the medical side, because a lot of people went through the neem tree precursor school of thought. Again, she went back to our Constitution and its definition of economic rights, drawing our attention to the fact that we need to advocate for, a more inclusive definition that would take account of unpaid care work. And then she called for gender-sensitive responses. The CAPBAS, or the poverty alleviation, the COVID business thing. You know what I mean, the CAPBAS, yeah. And then also the Ghana case, the fact that it can have tremendous prospects because it targets manufacturing and textiles and government, which have the potential to reach large numbers of women. But she cautions that we need to have a gender lens in considering the ways in which these are implemented. So that's also another area of monitoring and advocacy for us. She concluded on a very enhancing and uplifting note by celebrating our heroes who had excelled and made us proud. Her recommendation areas too are very exciting. They have prospects for our advocacy, our research, and further work. Social security for the informal sector, the fact that more attention to the disproportionate effects of people in the informal economy, the impact of unpaid work and the importance of unpaid work and the care economy. I mean, the fact that that area is gaining momentum and we need to look at it, including providing viable and effective public support, public sector support for it. The rising care dependency ratio requires that we look at public provision of care services. And finally, she talked about paid paternity leave. I think there are pockets of provision in this country. We need to look at how those have worked out and how we can upscale it. I know one organization that put it in their conditions of service and put a caveat that you can't have more than 3 paternity leaves in a year. You see, because yes. Because I think some men were doing paternity leave 3 times for 3 different children. Ladies and gentlemen, I open the floor for discussion. Thank you very much. So this is what we're going to do. We're hoping to be able to give it a good kick, but also manage time. So I'm going to take 3 and then make your submission. Madam, you've talked plenty. The ones you can answer, answer. The ones you can't answer, feel free to leave it. Okay, do I recognize Auntie Dorcas number 1? Who's going number 2? Number 2. Ah, Uncle Kwasi Jonah, you are number 2. You are welcome. And then who else am I having? I don't know, Titi Utima, are you number 3? Good, I've got number 3. Right, who's helping with this
one? Thank you very much, Dr. Gloria Afominsan, right? I mean, your presentation for some of us is only reaffirming some of the things we know. And I really want to focus on the medium, small scale business support thing. At the time, that was in 2020, 2021, we're doing a program in the Agona. Where is it? Agona Center. Gomua. And so the women we were working with, we asked them, some of them were business in quotes, small scale. So we asked them if they had heard about the business support. Some hadn't, some had. But unfortunately, for some of them, even though they had heard about it, they didn't qualify as you rightly put out. They were not registered businesses. They didn't have the TIN. Even if they did, they didn't have the TIN, and so on and so forth. And for some of them, this also opened opportunity for them to be duped. Because some of the people were registered, okay, give me money, I'll register you so you can. So it was all, and I think that in our recommendations, something that we should do is how do we build the capacity or train these women so that if they want to move from the micro to the next level, they should take some of these things seriously. Registering their businesses, getting all the things, because all of these things, when it comes to getting support, if you don't have them, then you won't. So we really need to get these women to say that they cannot be forever working at that level. If they want to push on, there are certain things they need to do. And I think for me, that is something that we should put in our recommendations so that next time something like this is happening, then, because we must move as a country from the predominance of informal and move people to the formalized sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Number 2 is Professor Jonah over there. Whilst we take the mic there, I want to acknowledge our online participants. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Okay. Please.
Thank you very much, Antester. As usual, I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I would like to look at those who are usually ignored in studies of this nature. So, for example, commercial sex workers. And domestic workers, particularly those who travel abroad to do this kind of work. You know, when the pandemic broke out, some of their employers thought that they themselves would be the source of transmission, so they lost their jobs. They lost their jobs outside and so on and so forth. But for me, it is the commercial sex workers case because they tend to have very, very little sympathy. Nobody, everybody has a very negative perception of the kind of work they do, and therefore, whether COVID affects them or does not affect them, nobody cares. So, if she can give a little bit of information, if she doesn't have your principle, just for, But another area that I would also like to have a bit of information is the dropout of ladies, young women who were in school or doing some kind of training. Because of COVID, they came home, and then it just happened that they somehow became pregnant, and they don't go back to school after COVID. So, if there's any information that you can share with us on these aspects of the matter, I'll be very, very grateful.
Thank you very much. And number 3 is around the table right in front of me. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Auntie Dorcas. You mentioned the issue of getting our women prepared for government interventions and policies. It's very important. Most of the time we do the advocacy, but we have got to prepare them for those opportunities. I also want to add up on the domestic violence issue and sexual abuse. In the period of the COVID, and according to Ghana Health Service research, we have almost 11,000 young girls pregnant. So almost 3,000 out of that is between the ages of 10 and 14. That is going to be a negative impact on our livelihood as women in a few years to come, because most of those girls cannot go back to school. Because those we find in our project areas are not able to come back to school, even though Ghana Education Service has a policy. But where are the resources for them to access to get back to school? They are not available. So these issues we need to include, so that as we go forward, these young girls, what happened? And those were the recorded ones. It could be up to 20,000 or even more. So we have to look at it. And also the issue of the law. These girls that have been impregnated and have become teenage mothers, no one single person has been prosecuted. And who is responsible for the prosecution is another issue. So we would need to look at the legal framework as well as the interventions that come along with preparing our women to access government policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I guess the first and then the last comments are, I mean, there are no questions, there are comments. So, but what, yeah, there are comments that, thank you, I'll just incorporate in the main report. But with regard to what Professor Jonas said, so the issue, I'll start from the third one when he talked about the dropped out girls and then being pregnant and that. And so when I was looking at it from global perspective, I indicated that Save the Children Foundation had actually projected that between 2020 and 2025, we're going to have about 2.5 million girls who will be at risk. And unfortunately, the regions that will be at more risk include West Africa, for which Ghana is included. So clearly, it's something that, as a nation, we have to take seriously. And I'll just tie in with what you also suggested. So I think some time ago, I heard about the GES canceling the issue of if a person, a girl gets pregnant, cannot continue, but now you can continue. And I think in Tanzania, they have started that. They've enforced it. And I saw in the news some time ago, they had a high number of girls who had given birth and they were in school and were doing well. So yes, we as a nation, probably we can also look at how they are implementing it. Yes, so it is good that we incorporate it in our GES law, but how do we enforce it? Because we have families, I mean, in Ghana here, the family is responsible for, ensuring that the girl is in school. But if I decide that, no, my child is pregnant and I'm not taking it to school, what does the law say? How do we enforce the law? So I think it goes beyond having it in our laws to enforcement. Because if you look at our laws, I mean, we have a lot of beautiful stuff in there, but the issue had been the implementation. And so if you even talk about the issue of domestic workers, so I'm doing something along that line, not for this work, but the challenge now here is most of our surveys don't include domestic workers. So if you look at what the Ghana Statistical Service does for the Ghana Living Standard Survey, it's only in the most recent one, which was done in 2016, 2017, that they specifically recall those who are engaged in domestic work. So, but that's even paid domestic work. And so we have very little information. And I recall that I think about 2 or 3 years ago, we had our employment minister talking about, passing a law on domestic workers. And up to now, we don't really know how far that has gotten to. And so it's also another, if we are advocating for a market for paid care work, then domestic workers are very key because they are the key providers. So if I have money and I want to buy care from the market, I employ their services. So in as much as I'm calling for, more attention to the care economy, it includes that. So that's where we can even capitalize. So it's not just about letting the private sector, but these are things that we can incorporate. So yes, thank you, but the policies will have, but I think the challenge will be the implementation. But that's a very good area that we need to take good care of and talk more about so that, it can get up there.
Great. Can I have another round? Yes, Pauline, I'm looking at you. Regina, I'm looking at you. Madam, I'm looking at you. Because of the mask, I'm not sure. And then you are number 4, please. Okay, but who's helping me out? Yeah.
Again, I echo the thanks for your excellent presentation. You had mentioned that, I think one of the points you made was that one of the sectors which saw a downturn was ICT. And I found that a bit of a surprise because given the nature of the pandemic and the fact that most of us and even retail was forced to go online, I would have thought that we would have seen an upturn in ICT and ICT. And then on the back of that, I was wondering if you had any data on the number of women and who had begun online enterprises, because I think that has become quite a thing these days. where there's so much going on online, there's so much retail taking place online, so much business taking place online. Is there any information about that with regards to women's participation in that, given the fact that there is, let's say, women are on the losing side in terms of ICT, but this is a space which is also seeing a huge upsurge.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afo, for that wonderful presentation. I just have one quick question. I think from the presentation, we have all seen that women were highly hit by the COVID, in part of the COVID. But did you look at women with disability? Because I think you presented on women in general. I just want to find out if you had any data on how women with disabilities were affected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc, for your presentation. Mine is just a comment to buttress your recommendation for conscious female farmers selection, being that there are lots of factors that, impede women's accessibility to some of this support that goes on in such times. One being land ownership. We all know that a lot of women within our context actually do not own land. And even when they own lands, the size of the land is so small. Also, what are the kind of crops that they, plant on those lands? They are not cash crops. They are not crops that can be imported, exported to, get some revenue for the country. It's mostly food crops for the house, crops that can be sold just in the nearby market. Also, looking at the kind of support that they get on the farm. So you have all these male-dominated farms having all the machinery, having the ability to employ more workers, laborers. But when it comes to the women farmers, it's difficult. First of all, they don't have the money. They can't afford the machinery. So then it means that the kind of labor they require on the farms, they don't even get. So if there is no conscious effort to select women farmers to benefit from some of these interventions, then it means that they will be left out at the end of the day. Because most of the time, the government is looking at what will bring, the enormous benefit to the country, and then they will end up looking at what the men are doing as against what the women are doing. So I appreciate the fact that you talked about the conscious female farmer selection. Thank you.
Very much. Yes. On the same table. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, Doc, I want to find out if through your readings you came about anything on reproductive health.
Sorry, can you raise your voice and
The reproductive health of women during the COVID, during the pandemic. If you came across anything about women and their reproductive health, their rights and access to reproductive health during this pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, most of them were comments good. So I just went back to the graph on ICT. So okay, the presentation is not shown there. So the graph showed all the major industries we have in Ghana. Okay, and clearly, if you look at the ICT, it was among the industries that recorded very low closures. So you see it there, but in fact, the COVID affected everything. So if you talk about ICT, for instance, certain services were needed, and it took time for firms to incorporate those services. So for instance, even in Legon, remember when before we moved to online, it took some time. So the computer service directorate had to incorporate certain things before we can get access to Zoom, before we can do so. There's always that lag, okay. But if you look at the charts, they were among the industries that had very low closure rates. So they, in a way, benefited. Okay, so, and then I think he also raised an issue about women with disabilities. So this is also a micro-level analysis. And I said earlier that we don't have the data available, so we're making efforts to get the data. And that is the only way we can get to know some of these micro issues. Okay. And I think the last one has to do with the reproductive health. Again, that's a very good question. So when I checked the questionnaire that the Ghana Statistical Service used, they talked about health, access to healthcare services and rights to healthcare services. So they asked households where, you have individuals answering whether the COVID affected their access to certain, health services that they had numbered. So antenatal care services, so many services. So it's only when I get access to the micro data that I can speak to this, well. But what I presented here, because we don't have access to the micro level data, it's just to look at the broad, trend and then have some sort of deductive reasoning to it. But the micro level data will help us support some of these arguments.
Right. I'm going to take just two more because my terms of reference, I should get you out of this room by 5. So I will, sorry, I can't, I'm growing old, so I can't see your face very well, but you know who I mean. And then, is there any other? Okay, then the last one there. Yes, please. Okay, there we go. Yeah, Pauline, you two are becoming, you're over 50 now, so. When we started life, she was young. Now she's not so young. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Please go ahead. Go ahead, madam. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bavina Safia Musa. Yes. Thanks so much for the presentation. I like that we are tying in the effects of COVID on children, particularly girls, because we cannot have conversations about women in isolation of girls. I want to bring in this case around Kayaye. I'm getting the sense that as a country, we are getting fatigued with the conversation on Kayaye. Because lately, it seems to be getting lost on a lot of platforms. And I just hope that we are not giving up as a country because it's getting worse by the day. Now, COVID came, and for 9 months, 10 months, children were at home. And for a lot of rural families, for them, you are 15, you're at home, you are not going to school, what is next? Get married. So child marriage was on the rise. And for girls who didn't want to marry in very rural northern Ghanaian communities, it meant that they had to find an escape. For many of them, Kayaye was their escape. And I have a lot of examples from my own village. So they left home to the big city and exposed to all the risks that comes with it. They managed to survive, and then 10 months later, schools resumed, and going back becomes a problem. They had come to enjoy the city because they were making some monies, and they didn't want to go back home. So when we count I don't know what data we truly have about the return rate for girls after, after lockdown was over. I believe we lost a lot of girls to Kayaye and many other social, situations like that. I'm bringing it in to say that as we take account of this, the impact of COVID on, the status of women in our country, I think Kayaye is one of the strongest ones. And I want to put out this call to all of us in here that we can't get tired of that conversation. Politicians are tiptoeing around it, but I think that we would have to set the agenda, and this is us in this room, and get the conversation happening and getting a lasting solution to it. Otherwise, I'm really afraid for the future of young girls in the North. Thank you.
Let me give the last word to Auntie Dorcas, and then you answer and then we close, okay?
I just wanted to, agree with her to, for, is it Nafsatu? Okay. Okay. Because, and I think that we have to recognize that it's not only in the north. COVID, if you go to some rural communities across the country, a lot of girls have dropped out of school, and I think Gloria mentioned it. And when you go to these places, they are not doing anything. They don't come to the south as probably those people from the north. But it's an issue that we need to address as a country. How do we get our girls to go back to school and stay in school? That is why we saw an increase, or we've seen an increase in teen pregnancies in the last couple of years. So we need to do something about it in this country. It's a big challenge that we are, and we all know, if women are not educated, it affects their children. So we'll then be having this cycle, because, it just goes on and on and on. And so I think that we really need to take this very seriously as a country. And finally, I think the issues around disability and some of the things, they require additional research. And I'm throwing to all of us here, those of us in organizations, to take up some of these challenges and do in-depth studies on some of these things, because Dr. Afro was only relying on secondary data. She didn't do a primary research, so it will be difficult for her to get all this information. So I think that for those of us who are here and who think that, maybe my area is in women with disability and we need this kind of information, I think it's important that we also commission research ourselves so that we can get and disseminate the information widely, so that we would know that these things are there, and we see how we can then intervene in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for I think they are largely comments, and I agree with you. So I'm even research in these areas. I was just asking myself, yes, it's good we do the research, but at the end of the day, we have very good policy recommended. But the question is, how do we get to the policymakers? As researchers, I mean, it's like work gets stuck there, and then somebody has to implement it. And I think NETRIGHT is, one of the platforms. So as we talk more about these things, well, for want of a better expression, let me just use our local language. I will get to the ones who are supposed to hear. And so we don't have to be discouraged. We can only do more and do our part. And then we hope that the right people will be attracted. Once we make much noise about it, they'll be attracted to some of these issues. And then, we would be able to make our voice known and then be implemented, as we are saying here. So, yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted at what we have. There have been contributions that have been made on Facebook and through our various social media channels. I'm going to invite Cynthia to read some of these out. Cynthia, do you have a mic?
Yes,
and then
please.
After she's done, I'll conclude, then we'll go home. Is that okay with everybody?
Okay, so there are 3 comments. Andela Apeke says, domestic workers were badly affected by the pandemic. Some of them were sent home without any remuneration from their employers. Those who remained in their employers' households were burdened with extra household chores, which was not accompanied by extra salary. I guess that's what she was saying. And And then there's another one. We can consider roping the informal sector on our social security system. And then Anne also says we have a legislation for domestic workers now. That's the Domestic Workers Regulation LI 2408/2020. Thank you.
Fabulous. That is a great place to begin to end this discussion. I think we've had a lot of food for thought provided by Dr. Afo-Mensah and from your rich submissions. I also had my wish list for micro-level analysis when you do get it. For instance, how were older women impacted? You see, as we are looking at the various categories, we talked to some extent about children, we talked a bit about adolescents, we talked a bit about working women and older women. I think my issue around women with disabilities and the different types of disability, physical disability, those with visual impairments, social distancing, and all of those kinds of things. I would love a little microanalysis around that. Again, I was very much interested in urban-rural differentiation and impacts. I'll be interested to know that. But again, I'm very mindful of the lack of disaggregated data, which is where Auntie Dorcas is concerned that if we have given, these are leads to things that we want to study further, and our organizations can take up, looking at these issues in some detail. I think Dr. Afo-Mensah in her submission referred to studies by WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. Last week, they launched a study that they had done of women and gender differentials and the COVID impacts on informal economy operators, market women, itinerant traders and hawkers, kaya, and then truck pushers, and then various waste pickers. So again, Safia, there were issues that the kaya raised, even in the discussion session, which are the beginnings of our intervention, our advocacy, our support to keep the conversation going. Women in farming in the more remote rural areas are areas that we need to also look at. Gloria, I take your point with, and I take your point yesterday also, that what the kinds of support that was had. We have tended to focus on support that went through government channels. We've tended to look at that. But I'll be very interested in also looking at what civil society support did, and also particularly what the faith sectors did and what the organized labor activity areas were. That should also be very interesting for our work. So, and then last week too, well, I think last week or earlier this week, CSPS has also done a bit of analysis from a gender equality and social inclusion framework. So that will be also interesting to augment, validate, and even support a lot of the conclusions you came to. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much. It's been a brief but exciting afternoon. I want to thank you all, those who made it possible, those who worked behind the scenes, those who've made it possible for us to link up with our online collaborators, and to say that, yeah, everything, happy March, International Women's Day, Ghana's independence, and everything else. Thank you very much. Patricia, I'll finish.
You finished. Thank you very much, Esther. I think we've had a lovely, very relaxed afternoon and learned a lot of good things that we can use going forward to do more in-depth analysis and advocacy work. Remember, NETRIGHT, we are about advocacy. So how can we use this information to advance our advocacy work in the different sectors that we work in. So on this note, I'll call the annual review closed. I wish you all safe travels home and happy March, as Auntie Esther would say. Thanks. Bye-bye.